Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, America's top diplomat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, flew to Israel for a second time in 2.5 weeks, where he met with Israeli War Cabinet. That's the new Unity Government War Cabinet. And there he called for a humanitarian pause to the conflict in Gaza.
We need to do more to protect Palestinian civilians. We've been clear that as Israel conducts its campaign to defeat Hamas, how it does so matters. I've seen images, too, of Palestinian children, young boys and girls, pulled from the wreckage of buildings. When I see that, when I look into their eyes through the TV screen, I see my own children. How can we not?
Now, following those remarks from the U.S. Secretary of State, two things happened. In a brief address to the nation, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu swiftly rejected calls for any kind of humanitarian pause, invoking the more than 200 hostages believed to currently be in Hamas's custody in Gaza. That, despite the fact that last week, Israel's military pointedly did not seem to consider those hostages a strategic priority before their incursion into Gaza. The other thing that happened was that the Israeli military took credit for bombing an ambulance outside Gaza's largest hospital. That's the Al-Shifa hospital that we've been reporting on throughout the conflict. The Gaza Health Ministry says multiple people were killed and dozens more injured. The Israeli military claims the ambulance was shielding Hamas militants, as it often does when justifying why it believes civilian infrastructure is a legitimate military target. The Health Ministry, which is under the authority of Hamas, denies those allegations. According to the Washington Post, quote, the dead and wounded visible in the videos reviewed by the paper included women and children, and no weapons or individuals wearing military clothing could be seen. For now, it does not seem that the Israeli military or government is particularly open to the White House's argument for a pause to protect civilians. And while the Biden administration has fallen short of calling for a full ceasefire, as some Democratic members of Congress have called for, the call for a pause, nonetheless, represents a shift, a marked one, actually, in tone for the White House. President Joe Biden has always been a stalwart supporter of Israel, dating all the way back to his time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Well, Senator Biden, back in 1986, following the barbaric attacks on October 7th, the president's initial instinct was to stand firmly with Israel, both, I believe, out of genuine moral principle. It's what he believes, as well as U.S. strategic alliances. And the approach that I think President Biden adopted with Benjamin Netanyahu, who he has known for decades and talks about that all the time, is that he would publicly pledge his full support and solidarity to the people in Israel, and then behind the scenes, whenever possible, he would try to affect the trajectory of Israel's response while maintaining that public posture of unwavering support. That was clearly the plan. Now, it is true, as numerous national security officials in the U.S. government had said to me, that there is not a single nation on earth that would have experienced the atrocity Israel went through last month and not responded with some kind of military action. Israel was always going to do something. And that's particularly true when you consider the ancient foundational trauma of a pogrom, elicited by the mass slaughter of Jewish men, women, and children in a state created to stop such an atrocity. But there is the abstract principle of Israel's right to self-defense amid mass atrocity, its right to go after the perpetrators of these attacks, which I believe everyone in the U.S. government around the world immediately afterwards, many agreed with. And then there's the actual government of the State of Israel, the actual government, the men and women that will empower the actual politics and mechanisms of that state response. Right now, it's a unity government run by Benjamin Netanyahu, which prior to the attacks last month was a hard-right government run by Benjamin Netanyahu, considered by many Israelis to be one of the worst, if not the worst, government in the country's history. A Netanyahu government that, first of all, at the most basic level, had the worst security state failing of any government in the world since maybe 9/11 and maybe further back. A government whose primary military objective prior to these attacks appeared to be pursuing its own ideological goals of settler expansion in the West Bank rather than focusing on national security. It's also a government whose explicit strategy for stopping a Palestinian state was to make sure there was divided regimes between Gaza and the West Bank, which meant supporting Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu said that famously at a party meeting of his own Likud party in 2019, according to various reports of people who were there. Not to mention the fact that Netanyahu himself is also currently under indictment on corruption charges in Israel, charges he denies. And much like Donald Trump, his current attempts to seize and retain power seem inextricably linked to his own self-preservation. That includes his recent effort to basically take over the Israeli courts and remove the lone single independent check on the executive authority in the state of Israel. That power grab led to widespread protests across the country for months, the largest in Israel's history, with Netanyahu quickly becoming something of a pariah among many of his own constituents.
Not only this particular law that might pass now, but the line of legislation is going to turn Israel into in the best case, a hollow democracy, in the worst case, a dictatorship. And none of us, Air Force pilots, want to serve in an Air Force of a dictatorship.
Those concerns of eroding democratic norms were exacerbated by the fact that Netanyahu's current coalition may well be the most right-wing government in the country's history, which has collaborated with some of the most fringe, vile figures in all of Israeli politics, in some cases, even in the highest positions of power. Take, for example, Israel's current Minister of Internal Security. That man by the name of Itamar Ben-Gvir. This is a man that even the Israeli military refused to draft as a teenager over concerns about his extreme far-right views, according to the Times of Israel. Ben-Gvir openly admires a terrorist, a guy named Baruch Goldstein, who perpetrated one of the bloodiest acts of anti-Palestinian terror back in 1994.
It's the bloodiest act of violence ever to occur in the occupied territories. A Jewish settler opened fire indiscriminately this morning on Muslim worshippers in a crowded mosque during morning prayers. The settler, identified as an American immigrant, slipped past armed guards at the Tomb of the Patriarch in Hebron, a holy site for Jews and Arabs.
Baruch Goldstein, a Jewish American who went to Israel, murdered worshippers in that mosque. Ben-Gvir and his wife reportedly had their first date at the site of that mass murderer's grave. And for years, Ben-Gvir had a big, laudatory, admiring poster of him, the one you see there, in his living room. That picture was considered so offensive, so beyond the pale, that even other far-right politicians in Israel wouldn't stand for it. He was effectively barred from joining the current government, literally unless he took the picture down. And under enormous pressure, Ben-Gvir agreed to take the picture down in a self-pitying social media post. That guy, Ben-Gvir, he's still in power. In fact, he is ordering at least 10,000 guns to arm Israeli settlers in the West Bank, settlers who have only stepped up markedly their campaign of violence, intimidation, and terror against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank who have nothing to do with Hamas since the October 7th attacks, as reported by Sky News in this package.
They've lived here for generations, but they've decided enough is enough, and the entire population of the West Bank village of Zonota is moving. They have no choice. Israeli settlers have harassed them and threatened them. Now they are being told by the Israeli Defense Forces that they have a week to leave.
A whole village of Palestinians forcibly ejected from their homes by Israeli settlers. This is what's happening right now in the West Bank as this war happens. And one of Israel's own intelligence services, along with less extreme members of its right-wing government and many Israelis, are very concerned about exacerbating tensions in the West Bank, about opening another front when Israel is in this incredibly perilous situation. But this is a coalition government where some of the far-right members believe fundamentally all of Israel is theirs, that the enduring state they look for, openly, they say this, is one in which Jews control all of greater Israel, including the West Bank, and they just keep Palestinians occupied and sedate. It's not the abstract principle of the right to self-defense or reacting to atrocity There are real people in a government making real decisions. So when Secretary of State Antony Blinken shows up and calls for restraint, what does he think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or his minister with the mass shooter poster are going to say? In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, Israel's defense minister justified the total and immediate blockade of Gaza of all fuel and water and everything, which has led to the unprecedented humanitarian crisis, by saying, quote, "We are fighting monsters and we are acting accordingly." Human animals was the translation, but some say monsters is closer in the original Hebrew. At least one member of Israeli parliament has called for a Nakba, or the catastrophic mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, the likes of which the world has never seen before. This is a Knesset member. The New York Times reports that in private conversations, Israeli military leaders told U.S. officials that civilian deaths are just fair game. They compared their strategy to the Allied bombings of Germany and Japan, the two atomic warheads in World War II, the ones that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Whatever the Israeli military says publicly about minimizing Palestinian casualties, the ideological view of many people in that government are that they don't really matter. NBC News is now reporting the Biden administration has growing concerns over the course Israel is taking in this war. And yes, they should be concerned.